Welcome to History 111, Lecture 19, Post-War Expansion. Now, by this time in the nation's history, most of the good agricultural land in the East was already taken, and there was a lack of opportunities for new settlers in the East. Now, the War of 1812 had come along and weakened many native tribes and removed a number of obstacles to expansion. So the government's going to begin erecting forts to protect lands gained from natives during the war, and what's called the factor system begins. And that's going to be the government supplying goods to tribe at cost to cut Canadian merchants out of the loop and make the tribes dependent on the United States rather than on Canada, because they really don't want any further British interference. And doing all this is going to open up a lot of lands for large-scale settlement. Now, with those obstacles removed, mountain men, as they're called, are going to spread into what they term the Northwest back then, and that's the area around the Great Lakes. And the reason it's called the Northwest is that's really where the northwest corner of the country was for all intents and purposes at that point. Now, these mountain men are going to spread ultimately up river systems toward the Rockies and engage mainly in fur trade. Now, this is a trade that had been originally dominated by natives and Canadians, but have been really pushed out of the market, and the furs are often going to be expensive and in high demand, so there's going to be a lot of potential to make money there. In addition, the plantation system is going to spread into Alabama and Mississippi, being driven by cotton. Now, Alabama and Mississippi, some parts of those two states are already within the United States, but the southern portion is disputed about who owns it. Is it owned by the United States or is it owned by Spain? In addition, there's going to be a widespread exploration of all these new territories. A lot of it's being sponsored by the War Department. A lot of new maps are being drawn to determine what's where. And that's going to really facilitate additional expansion. And the last factor that's going to drive it is all these stories of frontier life flood the East Coast, and it gets heavily romanticized. So people want to go see the West, and they want to go out to what they see as being adventure. Now, John Quincy Adams, who is the Secretary of State at this time and happens to be the son of the former U.S. President John Adams, he's going to negotiate the acquisition of Florida. What happens there is Andrew Jackson had invaded Florida with the army and seized key locations and had begun a punitive expedition against the Seminole, and he had engaged in some execution of British subjects who were supplying them with arms and so on. Now, Jackson's actions were based on vague orders from Madison. His job was to put down Native American raids across the border, and it caused an international crisis when he decides to go ahead and seize this Spanish territory. Now, what happens is Adams goes and negotiates with the Spanish minister Onis, and they come with the Adams-Onis Treaty, which is going to settle the border. And what's going to happen is the United States is going to buy Florida for $5 million as part of the deal. Now, Adams had heavily implied that not settling this would lead to outright war. Spain also had to give up its claim to Pacific Northwest, and the American government gave up its claim to Texas in exchange. So what happens is all this territory simply gets settled as to who actually owns it now. Basically, the United States took it and then threatened Spain with outright war if they didn't accept a large cash payment and settlement of other issues. Now, we should understand that the seizure of Florida and the crisis that prompted there was happening at a time when Spain was relatively weak, because really by this point of 1812, the Spanish Empire in the Americas is beginning to collapse. And Spanish-American rebels are going to declare independence, and their major trading partner is going to be the United States. Now, the United States is going to declare neutrality in a lot of these conflicts, and what that implies is that the rebels had a legitimate status as nations, because you don't declare neutrality in a rebellion, you declare neutrality in a war between legitimate states. Now, the U.S. is going to continue to supply things to the revolutionaries, even though we're officially neutral, so we're going to basically back them. And by 1822, the United States is going to be the first to recognize a lot of new countries as the Spanish Empire is breaking up. Now, ultimately, what we really had in mind was that President Monroe wanted to grab Cuba, although he never could quite get around to it. Now, more important than that, he wants to keep other European powers out. So if the United States isn't going to get Cuba, at least he wants to make sure that nobody else has it. So what we do as the United States is we declare the Americas closed to further European expansion. And what's called the Monroe Doctrine says that any hostile act against a new nation in the Americas will be regarded as a hostile act in the United States. In other words, if you make war on Mexico, it's a war with the United States. If you make war on Argentina, it's a war with the United States, and so on. That's going to help secure U.S. investments and U.S. interests and so on, although that policy that's put out there is really, again, the work of John Quincy Adams, and it's really a question of how are they going to manage the breakdown of the Spanish Empire in the Americas in a way that benefits the United States. an issue that expansion really drives to the forefront is slavery. Now, if we look at northern states, what we see is there is a trend to get rid of slavery in most places. And in most places, they do a gradual reduction. What that means is they declare that all persons born after a certain date are free, and they often have provisions to buy the freedom of anyone who was already in the status of slave. The idea being that over time, slavery within that state will go ahead and go away. Now, a couple of states go ahead and do it immediate, that on a certain date everyone is freed, but that's really the minority pattern. The majority pattern is go ahead and phase it out and get rid of it. Now, do realize that in the states where they're doing this, there's not a large slave population, so this is an issue that's very easy to correct. And you also see that the neighboring states in this region, when they're formed, are also being created as free states. So what we get is, we're getting a North that's basically removed slavery. Now, do realize that slavery had been legal in all colonies, and of the 13 original colonies, 6 of them are still slave states in 1820. Now, slavery is expanding into new states or pre-existing. So Kentucky, for example, is created out of Western Virginia, where slavery was legal, so Kentucky also inherits slavery. And the same thing happens with Tennessee when it was created out of Western North Carolina. Now, 3 slave states were created out of territory acquired through the Louisiana Purchase or from Spanish West Florida. Now, the United States did, by the way, you should know, claim that Spanish West Florida was part of the Louisiana Purchase, and Spain had also claimed that land, and that was something that the Adams-Onis Treaty had also settled, was that was now part of the United States. So if we look at the big picture, by 1803, all northern states were free states, and all southern states were slave states, and that makes for a 50-50 divide. Now, new states were admitted by chance in a way that kept the balance in 50-50, except for very short periods where there was an odd number of states. Now, by 1818, there were 22 states, 11 and 11. In 1819, Missouri applies for admission. And this is where something begins to change, because people begin to notice this 50-50 divide and begin to think about it. And bills were introduced to gradually ban slavery and eliminate it from this new state. Now, previous to this, slavery had been a state question, but now was becoming a federal question. Now, while this is all being debated, Maine applies for admission. Slavery was already illegal in Maine because Maine was being split off from Massachusetts, which had made it illegal previously. Now, to keep this issue spiraling out of control in Congress, because there's a lot of heated debates about what is going to happen here, the 2 states are packaged together and called the Missouri Compromise. And what they decide to do as part of this Missouri Compromise is Maine will be admitted as a free state, Missouri will be admitted as a slave state, and they're going to maintain that balance. They're also going to establish a framework for which states will be free and which states will be slave, based on some geographic considerations, and that's going to really set up some things that we're going to talk about more and more during this course. One last thing to realize is pretty key is that the martial court is very active, and the Supreme Court is really expanding its power. And as they're doing this, they're also expanding the power of the federal government and transferring more and more power from the states. Now, as the country's starting to see a sectional divide, this is going to aggravate this, and the idea of states' rights really begins to catch on, and slavery becomes a new hotbed issue. So the idea of states' rights, which had been something we saw in the War of 1812 with the Hartford Convention and people up in the North and Federalists, well, that whole idea is going to move to the South and be repurposed as part of this growing debate on slavery. So what's the big idea here? Well, there's a general movement of settlement towards the West, and that's going to raise some questions that the country is not necessarily prepared to answer at this stage. So what's going to happen to Native Americans? What's going to happen with slavery? And what are going to be the long-term consequences? These are things that nations are starting to realize are going to be issues, but nobody has solutions. In the short term, however, for Native Americans, they're looking at things like the factor system to try to make them dependent on the United States government. When it comes to slavery, it's the Missouri Compromise. It's a system to delay the question, and the Missouri Compromise is one of those things that's a really big issue in American history, and we definitely need to know it because we're going to be talking about it again later. See you in the next lecture.